hybrid work, shifting workforce expectations, unbelievable rapid technological advancements, the one thing that remains, leaders who prioritize people are the ones that will thrive in the end. Human-centric leadership isn't just a trend, it's the future. As organizations navigate change, the most effective leaders are those that continue to put an emphasis on building trust, creating psychological safety for their workforce, and put a big emphasis on how they can inspire their teams to do their very best work. In this conversation, we're going to break down the forces that are shaping this shift and really what it means to be a human-centric leader. And, we might add, a twist, what it doesn't mean, and the essential qualities needed to succeed in this endeavor.
Yeah, I'm excited for this conversation, Martin, because it is a term that we're seeing more and more. And I think particularly probably since the pandemic, there's been a lot more, diversity in terms of how and where and how people are working, and a greater focus on flexibility and different needs of different people. So I think it's a really important topic to explore, because I think the term itself, you might think it's only about focusing on the needs of individuals and people in the workforce, but actually, as we'll explore, it's something a little bit more than that. I think it's going to be a valuable discussion.
Yeah, it's very topical, and one that in a lot of the events we've done of the last 6 months, where we've sponsored events, where we've had senior leaders in a room talking about the trends and changes, it almost without steering it in that direction, it ends up in this place. People end up talking about culture.
Yeah.
Inevitably end up talking about cultural shifts, who end up talking about leaders, because leaders ultimately are the ones that are creating it in the first place by their acts, by their behaviors, by their principles, by their beliefs and values, and what they have deemed to be important in that organization starts to shape the way they lead.
Yeah.
What do you think some of the forces are that are actually changing this shift in emphasis?
I think, as I've already sort of mentioned, I think following the pandemic and the rise in hybrid working and that sort of thing, leaders are having to adopt a different approach because they haven't got their team around them. It's not the sort of traditional leader sitting amongst their team and being able to see and observe and guide and coach in a physical sense. Leaders are having to, lead in a different way because they haven't got their team necessarily all around them all of the time. I think that the speed of change as well, there's so much change going on, and that with it brings a sort of, can bring a sense of instability within a team, so I think that a leader has a role to play in really understanding more about the sort of human side of that and how their team are faring in that sort of environment, and put things in place to actually bring stability in an unstable environment. And I think the human-centric approach helps them to do that. What sort of things have you seen?
Well, they have. I think that there isn't the comfort or the space or the time to have those more sort of casual, on an online world, we don't necessarily make time for as much small talk. And look, when I ask a group of people how much of your time is spent having meetings online versus in person, it's a seismic shift. Of course, yes, having meetings online makes our lives very much more efficient. But is it always that effective? When we tend to get online, because we're kind of going from one thing to another, we don't make that same time for that personal connection.
No, and they're scheduled. They have to be scheduled, don't they? If people are physically in front of you and around you in a workspace, you can notice if somebody is maybe having a challenging day, or, you tend to get on an online meeting and you've got an agenda, you've got your game face on. Do you know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
very orchestrated.
So you have to be quite intentional about making that personal connection and allowing time for a little bit of small talk and connection, feeling, understanding what's going on in the team, what's been going on for people, asking a question about that,
Yeah.
rather than driving straight into the agenda and everybody sort of staring there, in a state of alertness that they might be called on or asked a question. Or
Yeah.
it's almost like you can sometimes see people in some meetings in a sort of fight or flight mode.
Yeah.
Very, very different to being in a space of more relaxed, engaging your emotional brain. You
Yeah.
feel and therefore that doesn't allow for people to open up, speak to their truth, have the courage to say really what they want to say. So, and then on top of this, we have, one of the most obvious changes that we keep hearing over and over again are these differences between expectations of different generations in the workforce.
Totally.
And I'm always at pains to point out, as we talk about these changes, it's nobody's fault. We can't start blaming people.
No.
Us looking over our shoulder I speak for myself as a baby boomer and complaining about, Gen X or Gen millennials or whatever, or Zs. Some people might say they're not as driven. What they probably will say is they're not interested in their purpose and what they're doing.
Yeah. Purpose, not pay.
Not so outcome focused.
Yeah. Yeah.
They would argue, and I think they are. They still have the same energy. They still have the same energy to want to do a great job, possibly even more. But that can get confused and misinterpreted by baby boomers as not being as on the front foot, not being as interested in the outcome and getting results. So, and maybe there are some differences there. If you go back in time, there was no question. It was a sort of badge of honor to almost kind of work long hours, hit burnout, even talk about burnout. It's like, brag about how long you've been working.
Yeah.
And I remember being part of one organization, which you will know, and it was like people were trying to outdo each other with how early they're prepared to start a meeting.
If you think about it, the view of millennials and the younger generations is actually a much more healthier, holistic way of approaching work. Success comes from many different angles, not just from having a really hard day at the office and achieving results and measuring it on one dimension. So maybe the baby boomers and our generations, maybe we're a bit jealous, and
no question, there's something to be learned from both. That's the point, isn't it? It's not making one wrong so the other can be right.
Yeah.
But of course, we tend to judge, baby boomers in particular, will tend to judge on what they did to get where they are. If you're of a different generation, your view of the world is your own experience. They don't have that experience. They have their own experience.
Yeah.
And if that experience is talking to their friends, family, peer group, this is how I'm working at work, this is what I'm doing, this is how I run my life, it becomes the norm for them. They haven't got any sort of sense of this is wrong, I should be doing something different. It's just normal.
Yeah.
Normal to prioritize things other than work, or it's normal to prioritize wanting to have a great time and not necessarily wanting to burn myself out every day.
Yeah. And
there will be people.
Goodness for that.
Listen, and I'm absolutely and we don't want to over egg this, because there'll be millennials listening to this thinking, well, I do burn myself out every day, or I do work really hard. And there are people that will be doing that as well. I'm not excluding those, not saying everybody is the same. I'm just saying as a theme, back in the day, it's that classic funny thing around the guy joking about, take, 2 jackets to work, one to leave on the back of the chair at 6:30 and one to wear home, just let the boss know and leave a few things on the desk, let them know, because that's what it was all about.
Sad, isn't it? That was ever what success looked like. And I think that since the pandemic, actually, it's not just exclusively to millennials and Gen Zs. It is actually a focus that more people place on it, because we did have that taste of flexibility and more home life. And even what we were talking earlier about the online meetings, I think that when we started to have more online meetings in the pandemic, we were more relaxed and we did get more of an insight into people's lives. And there was that sort of emotional connection. And now they've sort of become very efficient, and things are speeding up, so we're having more of them, and we're losing that lovely window that we did have for a piece of time in the pandemic, where there were news readers with their kids on baby walkers behind them, and we did have a conversation about, oh, what's that on the shelf behind you? And now it's all curated. And actually, I did move a load of rubbish out from behind me before we started recording this. Is it becoming too curated online? Should we be more relaxed and get more of the
let's not also dismiss the fact that actually during that period of time we did actually end up starting working even longer hours. Some people longer and longer hours, just purely the time they were commuting, they were now working. So the real distinction we're making here is about the desires and wants and values and what people are prioritizing. And employees are definitely gravitating more towards prioritizing values, diversity. I've got 3 kids grown up, seeing their 20s and 30s now. And I would say, compared to when I was their age, they are far more aware of things like diversity and how the organization is treating them. How they even make personal purchases based on what they know about an organization.
And ethical practices,
etc. So what does this lead to? It leads to our main point, doesn't it? The need to be more human-centric as a leader, because you could argue a lot of the people that are leading these people are of a different generation. And it's just important. I mean, particularly the work we do in professional services, where you will get some potentially longer serving partners looking after these more junior teams with a very, very different view of the world. I would say professional services are very advanced in their thinking generally. But not always the case, but generally.
But across the board, businesses changed, organizations have changed, employees are changing, so leadership also needs to evolve and change with that. The human-centric approach is worth exploring because it does provide, it's an upgrade in terms of how people lead their teams in this new and evolving context.
If you're going to have greater flexibility and you're going to have greater levels of autonomy, it requires a shift on both parts. It requires a shift on the leader to trust more and to be more human-centric. And it requires a shift on the part of your co-workers, particularly if you're leading those people, to demonstrate self-responsibility and accountability. It's no longer a thing that necessarily leaders should be, managing people in a way that they do take responsibility is bestowed upon that individual to take responsibility. Yes, and that's where some of the conflict can come.
It's not a shift in the balance of power. It's actually a collective responsibility that requires a different touch on both sides.
That's right, exactly. And having conversations about that, with somebody and saying, I'm happy for you to focus on outcomes, not on time served, not on time spent, rather. I'm much more interested in quality and productivity, and I'll leave you to decide how you do that. But I am expecting you to do it. That's the difference. So what does it mean to be a human-centric leader?
One definition that I found, and I'll read it because I want to get it right, but it said a human-centric leader is somebody who prioritizes people's needs, well-being and perspective fostering a sense of empathy, authenticity, and psychological safety within their team and organization. But I think that one needs building on, because it's not just all people first at the expense of everything else.
No.
It's actually that balance and increasing employee confidence, well-being, and resilience in order to be their best and show up their best and do their best work to achieve a result. I think it has to encompass both of those things.
So if we have a look at a few of those, I think, first of all, the one we've alluded to already, and that is connecting somebody's work to the bigger mission on purpose. And this is a point of conversation in the 360 we use to assess leaders, run by Zane Folkman. One of the key questions in there is, how much work have you done, and do you do a great job of connecting people to how their work impacts the bigger vision?
Yeah.
And that is, a deliberate conversation, because it's easy to set work for people and have a series of different tasks. And then, of course, that relationship becomes quite transactional.
Yeah.
When they realize actually the criticality of those tasks and how they link to the bigger picture, now I feel more motivated by doing it.
I'm reminded of a story that our previous guest, Jim Liptrot, shared, and he was doing a town hall or something like that. And in that communication that he had with his employees, he said, what we do saves lives. And he said somebody came to him the next day and said that they were having dinner, with their wife before, and it dawned on them for the first time, that actually what they were doing in the machine room or whatever it was, actually, that is what we do. We save lives. And that person had a completely different relationship with their work from that day forward. So it's really, really important. People want to understand why they're doing what they do and the greater cause.
In some shape or form, every product or service is enhancing someone's life, making their life easier, taking pain away, mitigating risk, saving them time, saving them money, bringing a healthier existence, making them safer. Yeah. Those are the types of things. One company we're working with at the moment, I was very inspired by their presentation. And they look after water. Pretty powerful when you think that your company is having an impact on the most precious resource in the world, and that is water.
Yeah.
Treatment of water, the conservation of water, making water available, bringing water to people so that they can actually use it as a life source is pretty powerful. So in some way, there is, some people might be thinking, well, that's easy if you've got those sort of big stuff like that. But I remember even a debt collection department I was working with, and we were working on purpose, and they finally came up. This is all these people do, is they collect the debt of the people who don't pay their bills of a utility company. And eventually they came up with this strapline, something like, we keep the company safe. In other words, what they worked out is if they didn't collect the debt, that would have a significant impact on cash flow.
Yeah. And
that would then have a significant impact on where they could spend cash on other things to grow and develop the company. So if they weren't doing that, they weren't keeping the company safe. For every dollar, every pound you collect is keeping the company safe. It might be tough, it might be difficult, it might be hard work, could be people sending you quite rude letters and not be pleasant to you, but you are keeping the company safe with every action.
And I think that understanding that purpose, even if things get a bit bumpy and a bit difficult, having that connection to why we do what we do actually helps you navigate some of those, more difficult times.
Look, I would suggest anyone listening to this in a position of leadership, don't just do the work and have the purpose. Tick box, done. We've got it hanging on the wall. Brilliant. Nicely done. Perfect. Talk about it. Yeah. Remind people. Try and link what somebody does to that. Let me remind you, Jack. Let me remind you, Susan. Let me remind you the work that you're doing is contributing to in a significant way. Let's make sure we keep moving in that direction. Second thing I think is this part of being human-centric. I'm reminded of the Google Aristotle project, where they were really trying to understand what do people consider to be the main attributes of a high-performing team. Lo and behold, what sits right at the top is making it safe for people, creating what is being termed as psychological safety.
Yeah.
Which is essentially, what does that mean? It means that people can speak to their truth, they can have the courage to give feedback, they can offer points of view that might be differing to other people because they know they're in a safe environment to do it. And that they're going to be supported. They're not going to be corrected. The leader's not going to go, well, that's not what I'm looking for, the first thing they say.
Yeah.
That shuts people down, or disagreeing immediately. But if someone is offering a point of view, often it does take a little bit of bravery and courage.
Yeah.
And to know that that idea is going to be at least given a little bit of airtime, or at least thanked for their contribution, engenders a feeling of, I'm willing to support and offer ideas.
Yeah. And I think that in line with that, creating a culture where people are encouraged to try things and learn things and test things and fail safely, rather than an environment where people are scared to try something in case it goes wrong. Things don't evolve and develop without a bit of testing and reviewing what goes well and what doesn't.
I would say this is such a, if someone's listening to this, they're probably thinking, I kind of know that. I mean, I've heard that tons of times before. I would ask somebody to really stop and think about that. Because yes, it's something we know about, but how safe? I see it over and over again because I'm in the world of coaching people, and I was having a conversation with a lady yesterday, and she's talking about this particular relationship she's got with this individual. It's not particularly healthy, things that are being said. And I said, have you spoken with them about it? No. And that comes up lots and lots of times. Tons of times I'm talking to someone in a meeting. Did you express that point of view? No. Why? Well, I wasn't sure how it's going to be received. It's much, much bigger than people think. It is so much bigger. And even, by the way, even when you've done all your values chat and you've talked about psychological safety and you've talked about DE&I, still people won't do it. Because why? It's not natural for us to confront or challenge. And particularly if you add to this a particular personality preference that moves away from confrontation. As I was saying to this leader the other day, it's up to you to create a level of psychological safety. And this person's actually just about to turn to become the CEO, and she wants to change a number of things, but she's also a person that avoids confrontation. And I said, you've got a kind of perfect storm here of one wanting to get feedback from people, them not feeling that brave to give it to you. You're not particularly overly comfortable with confrontation. So net, you're going to end up with people aren't really expressing their views. You won't really find out what people are really thinking until proverbial shit hits the fan at some point later and everyone's forced to have a proper conversation about something.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to understand what psychological safety actually means. Psychological safety does not mean preserving the status quo, keeping everything nice and friendly, never raising controversial thought or an opposing view. There was a study actually with MIT that said, overplaying the role of psychological safety actually can dampen down, intellectual honesty, because people aren't willing to share their views because they don't want to upset the status quo and don't want to put their head above the parapet or rattle somebody else. It is something that is in the mix, but not to be overplayed. If you overplay it or don't fully understand what it actually means.
I see this working with leadership teams. In fact, there was a couple of teams I worked with last year, and there was one team that was definitely falling foul to what we're describing here. They were drive for results, and there was a fear of people expressing how they were feeling. So there was a low on empathy, low on compassion, high on drive for results. Not the healthiest environment, but it was like everybody just kind of knew how far to go and how far to operate, but then they would stop. I remember the leader was quite surprised at how low their engagement scores were, and quite indignant about it actually, because they felt they were communicating their mission and their purpose and their values. But I said, well, it's not just about communicating it. You've got to be it. You have to set the example. The
People have to
second
be it,
example,
don't they?
yeah, the second example is the other way around. I was working with these two teams in parallel. It was quite interesting for me to observe. When we did the survey results, their building relationships, by contrast, was at the top of a pile of 19 competencies, very near the top. And the very bottom one was drive for results.
Mm.
So it's the complete opposite. They're prioritizing what you were describing just now.
Yeah.
There's so much emphasis on development of people, providing feedback, all probably orientated towards encouragement.
Yeah.
As opposed to corrective feedback. Holding people to account was not their bag.
Mm. And you can do that in a psychologically safe way, and I think that everything that we're talking about, human-centric, does not just mean focus everything on, protecting the well-being and being nice and creating that, harmonious environment. And actually the research from Zenger Folkman, and, exactly what you're alluding to, is that it's not just about empathy, which is one of the competencies, or drive for results. It's actually about a mix of two.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's worth exploring.
Yeah, I mean they talk a lot about this, and they do a lot of research on this. They look at what they're very good at doing is looking at the combinations of particular competencies when they're mixed together. And they found that leading with compassion and empathy whilst maintaining accountability at the same time was a exponentially shift in the performance of those leaders. So those leaders are able to do both. Exponentially were rated higher. So if you're gone for high empathy, and yes, you're good at understanding, you lean into what's going on in someone's world, you're taking a notice and a concern for them, staying in touch with their issues and high concern for others, but you're not doing this without drive, they're not delivering results.
Yeah.
At some later point, you're probably going to get a little bit irritated by that. And secondly, they are not going to feel that good about it either. So if you're giving feedback to someone and telling them they're doing okay, when actually they know they're not, that doesn't actually raise self-esteem. You think you're being nice to them in the moment, but in reality, they can just hear you saying something to make them feel good. They don't believe it.
Yeah.
They don't give you massive credibility for it. It doesn't make them feel that great. But actually what they want is some, I'm not going to use the word tough love, but just some truths about where we're at. And there is the magic of giving feedback in a compassionate way that is positioned against the need to both get results at the same time as demonstrating empathy. It really is a master skill.
Yeah.
You don't see it very often. It was actually with talking to a leader yesterday, and this leader had got some fantastic results. And we were talking about what to make even stronger. And she has this combination. Her drive for results and her empathy and understanding are both in the top 6. So if anything, I would make them even stronger, because that is going to be, something that will make a real difference to you. And she hasn't really appreciated it, but actually that is why she is getting such great feedback, because she has this wonderful combination of firmness and compassion.
And actually the Zenger Folkman research found that only 15% of leaders have that unique combination. Right. But when they do, I think it's the leaders who scored in the top 10% for drive and empathy actually were 4 times as effective of those that don't. And the confidence that their teams have in their ability to achieve their goals increases as well. So it's not just achievement of those results, but the confidence in the plan and ability to achieve those results.
It's very clear to see this is a very powerful combination. I would ask any leader listening to this to really be honest about it. If I was to put myself on a scale of holding people to account, what I describe as inspect against what you expect. You can't expect what you don't inspect. You set expectations but never talk about them again, indicating to that person that this wasn't that important. If I set an expectation up and then a couple of weeks later I'm checking in and say, how's that going? It's clearly indicating to them you're expecting them to do it. Yeah. So that's the first thing. How much of that are you doing? And when they're not doing it and you realize they're not doing it, what do you do about it? Do you then listen to a whole bunch of excuses that you've heard 15 times before and prioritize harmony and relationship over holding the person to account and just saying, look, this isn't what we agreed. I'm hearing the same reasons why we haven't done it this time as we talked about before. We can't continue this way. We have to find a better solution.
Yeah. Because otherwise everything's quite bland, isn't it? You don't get great feedback, you don't get constructive feedback to help you improve. So you actually don't know where you are as an employee, do you? If you're not getting feedback either way, everything's just like...
That's one of the things I really took from the xenophobia research, is that the net result of it is two things. One, if you do both, you will get better results long term, as you indicated. But I think even more importantly than that is that the person you're leading feels more confident.
Yeah.
They feel trusted. They feel they've got someone who is growing them and developing them, and they feel more inspired and they feel more confident to go after their goals and dreams because they've got a leader behind them who's being honest and who's going to coach them.
Feel supportive and
supported.
Yeah. Which is a key sort of attribute of a human-centric leader. The worrying thing from the research, I think, is that they found that as people went up through, raised through the ranks in terms of leadership levels, drive scores went up, but empathy scores went down, which suggests actually that are we promoting based on results and achievements and what people have delivered at the expense of the important trait of empathy?
Well,
do you see that in the work?
I think for all that we talk about the importance of being an inspiring, empathic, compassionate leader, there has to be, organizations are geared around results, share price, stock price, value of the company, whether it's privately owned, in the public domain, whatever. People expect a return for their investment. So you cannot get away from the fact that you have to get results. And those leaders, it's a hygiene factor in a way. You've got to get yourself into the frame. You've got to demonstrate you can produce results. What is different now, I think, is that you potentially will get less leaders promoted into those senior positions just because they get results.
Yeah, it needs to look at...
because they're not adhering to the values and all the other things we're talking about. So that is why we come back to this, our argument that human-centric leadership is both the combination of being able to demonstrate compassion, empathy, all the things we talked about, and get great results.
Yeah.
That is a super, super high value. And I fail to see, and it's the perfect combination. Long may it continue, because I enjoy the fact that organizations, but we've been doing this for 30 years, right? And we have seen the dial move towards this human focus. And I think it will actually continue. Not where it goes wrong is when it's at the expense of everything else and you'll become a bit flaky and fluffy. I don't subscribe to that. But
it's about heart and the hustle, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's both things that are required.
That trajectory is great. I think it's fantastic. Really do. And it does require more skill.
Yeah.
If you're going to do this, you've got to learn the skills to do it. You've got to learn the skills to have, guess what? If you're a high empathy person, you will probably have to focus a bit more on how you have difficult conversations, because you have such an emphasis on the relationship and empathy. You might find it difficult to have those more difficult conversations. Somebody, conversely, who is very strident about getting results, will have to work on their empathy skills.
Yeah.
Stepping into someone's world, asking them questions about it, slowing down, connecting with them. So there are two sets of skills there that need to be developed. And I think to wrap up here, I would be suggesting that people think about these qualities. Perhaps you might like to summarize what some of those things are for our listeners.
I think you're totally right. It definitely begins with self-awareness and reflecting on some of the things that we've talked about and to what extent you actually do that in the way that you lead your team. So connecting people to that why behind what they're doing, creating an environment that is psychologically safe and creates an environment where people can offer their views and feel safe to learn and develop in their roles without overplaying that psychological safety, which presents that sort of status quo, nice, warm and fuzzy environment at the expense of results. So it's definitely a combination of both. So
Performance focused. I mean, that's what we're really saying, aren't we?
yeah.
Self-performance focus. I remember there was a little, not to interject something new here when you're doing a summary, but there was 3 things we would ask people when you think about the triangulation of being performance focused, learning, culture, and enjoyment. And I think that little combination is really nice kind of way of thinking of it. Create a nice learning environment, as you're saying. Keep the performance focused and make sure it's enjoyable. Guess what? If you do those 3 things, people are going to hang around a lot longer, stay a lot longer, be more committed.
Yeah.
You'll create a more positive culture as a result.
And there's so much research that's been done around this topic. We'll link some of the articles that we've been researching in preparation for this podcast so that you can have a little bit more. But I think it's, to finish, it's just reflecting on the type of leader that you are and that you want to be, and thinking about, if there's any steps that you can take to be slightly more human-centric in your approach, but not at the expense.
Yeah. Where are the gaps when you think about these 2 forces? When you think about these 2 sets of skills, where are the gaps for you? Where are the things, if we're really honest about it, what do I need to get better at doing to be brilliant and to be exceptional at both delivering results and being compassionate?
Yeah, absolutely.
And by the way, if you do that, you're going to be in the top, what was it, 15%?
15%, just 15%.
That's worth putting a bit of effort and energy in. And you're becoming valuable to your organization. And as I say, at the end of every leadership session we do, we are either raising or lowering self-esteem. You are not raising self-esteem if you're telling people they're great when they're not. They know they're not. So let's be honest, let's be truthful to ourselves, let's be truthful to the people we lead as well.
Yeah, it's kind, even though sometimes it might not feel like it's the kind of thing to do.
Okay.
So as always, thank you very much for listening. We hope you have found lots of value in this conversation, and feel free to share it with others that might find it valuable as well. And
some people might want to be sharing with their boss, for example. This is really good. Let me subtly send this to my boss. Yeah, there you go.
That's fine. Now, I am very excited about our next conversation because it's something that I love researching about, and we are going to be talking about blue zones around the world. So the areas around the world that have the largest number of centenarians, so people that live to 100. So we're going to be discussing what some of those qualities are and how we can build some of those things in our day-to-day lives.
Fantastic. Look forward to that. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for listening.